Hello, welcome to this DecisionWise webinar. My name is Christian, and I'll be our host today, as well as one of our panelists. Our webinar topic today is 360-degree feedback, insights, and analytics. And I'm fortunate today to be joined by two of my DecisionWise team members, Kenna Bryan, one of our finest consultants and coaches, as well as Jefferson McClain, who leads our data science efforts here at DecisionWise. Kenna and Jefferson, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Christian. Happy to be here.
Excited as well.
Thank you. And this is probably a good time to say we are all joining remotely. And so there's a high probability we'll be talking over each other. So that'll be fun for our listening audience today. So a little bit of where we're headed today. We're going to talk a bit about our DecisionWise 360 feedback assessments and some of the data that we've been able to collect over the years. And Jefferson's done a great job of pulling a few insights for our conversation today. We're going to discuss some of the competencies in those 360 assessments. Specifically, we want to look at the high and low for different assessments that we run. I think there's some interesting insights to discuss and explore together, as well as some of the behavioral statements. We'll go look at some of those high and low items based on our different assessments. We'll look at some industry trends, as well as talk about repeat 360 trends. And as I mentioned before, we'll leave some time for some questions at the end of our time today. So before we jump in, maybe I'll just kind of set the stage a bit. And then Jefferson, if you can walk us through a little bit of what we're talking about here in terms of our different 360 assessment groupings. But at DecisionWise, we've been running 360 feedback assessments for years. Our roots go pretty deep in this space. In fact, we're one of the first organizations to move these things to online assessments, and we've got experience running these on floppy disks in the past. So we've been at it for quite a while. We have a number of off-the-shelf or kind of predetermined assessments that we run with our clients, as well as we do customized work. But for our conversation today, we're largely going to be talking about three of our most widely used assessments, those for executive leaders, those for business leaders, and individual contributors. So Jefferson, any kind of additional context around these different assessments?
Yeah, just that each of these assessments, we have thousands and thousands of people who have gone through these three, the executive, business leader, and individual contributor. So the data that we have behind this to provide some normative values is really vast. And generally, we see our executive leaders, they usually get the lowest scores across these three groupings. And our business leaders are generally in the middle ground. And when you think of a business leader, you're thinking of someone who is like a manager or a director level position in an organization. And individual contributors are either those who are new to the organization, or maybe they're just working professionals who aren't necessarily in management, and they usually receive the highest scores.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And maybe just even to set the table or just to kind of recap. So executive leaders, that's usually VP and above. Maybe some organizations would have directors that would be in that executive pool, but depending on the size, but it's usually the top of an organization. The business leader, that's our most broadly or widely used assessment, managers to directors typically, but it is the assessment where we have the most data. And as Jefferson said, individual contributors, those folks without direct reports, could be new employees, frontline employees, could be subject matter experts that just don't have a reporting line there, but also interesting to have, a lens into that. And also just to, again, add some context, it's fun to have this type of conversation because I know the work you do, Kenna, is so much involved in the individual conversations, some group reporting and things like that, but mostly it's how do we help this one individual with their 360 feedback report. And so an interesting opportunity to kind of zoom out and look at the big trends that Jefferson has compiled in our data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. I'm excited to dive in here.
So Jefferson, you mentioned executives generally receive the lowest overall scores across all items. Let's explore that a little bit. Why do we think that's the case? Why would our top of the organization receive some of the lower scores? And low is relative. It's not like we're seeing averages of 3. And by the way, just to recap, we do use a 7-point scale where 7 would be the highest mark. But why do we think that our executives are receiving the lower scores on their 360 on average?
So part of it, interesting, if you look at kind of the science and the data behind everything, those who are assessing executives, they tend to use almost the entire scale, right? All the way from 1 all the way to 7 when they're assessing those in the top leadership positions in an organization. And part of that could be just that added expectation of, hey, if you're at the top, then I kind of expect you to be at the top of your game as well. You're the front face of the organization, and we need you to be performing at that level. But I'm not sure, Kenna, if you've seen other trends or things that you could add to it.
Yeah, no, I agree with the expectation comment. I think that falls in line with what I see every day is there is that expectation for high performance and, that level of quality there at the top. Same thing for business leaders. I was just going to mention, I'm actually happy to see this be the case as far as all the data pulling goes, Jefferson, because, I coach every day and sometimes people are worried. Oh, I hope they're not just blowing smoke. I hope that, they're not worried about, oh, I'm scoring my manager or the VPs low. I better score them high. And so this to me shows that there's enough safety created here in this 360 process for this to be the case, that, people can be transparent, honest, and vulnerable in scoring business and executive leaders. So I'm actually kind of happy to see this be the case. And again, low is relative, right? By no means is a 5.4 a poor score.
I think that's a great call out because it does kind of help kind of validate the process and the confidentiality. People felt that it was safe to speak truth to power, the top of the organization, provide feedback. And so there's some evidence in these scores that the 360 feedback is that the programs are running well, that the instrument's functioning as designed. If we're not just telling executives what we think they want to hear, I think a really good call out there. And Jefferson, to your point also, the expectations are higher at the top of the organization, as well as in my coaching experience, I've seen, they're also symbols of how the company's doing. And so if I'm unhappy with the change initiative, this is an opportunity to point some of that feedback towards a direct leader, or as well as the instruments themselves are a bit different. So the competencies in the executive leader assessment are geared for executives. And there's a different set of competencies used there versus an individual contributor or a business leader. So as we go further in this, I think it'll be interesting to unpack where those executives scored the lowest and where they're scoring more favorably.
And Christian, just to add on another insight, as you think of the 360 process, right, you've got different individuals at different levels of the organization that are assessing the same person. And if you're an executive, then the people who are generally assessing you have more experience and tenure in the workforce in general. And so they've got that additional breadth and experience that they bring to the table when they assess you. And that could also be a contributing factor for why the scores are a little bit lower. But like Kenna say, I mean, these aren't bad scores by any means. I mean, they're still good scores, just trending lower.
Well, a good point to call out that rater population is different. So if I'm a VP receiving a 360 feedback, I'm being assessed by my peers, who I would assume are other VPs, perhaps by a C-suite executive as a supervisor, as well as direct reports that may be directors. And these folks, to your point, are more seasoned, have seen kind of what the professional landscape is, what's possible, and also perhaps maybe even more self-assured in terms of providing feedback upward. And so there's a few things that contribute to that. But all of this, I think, adds up to some healthy self-awareness for those leaders at the top to be able to receive some of this candid feedback like that. What do we think? I think we kind of infer the opposite with some of the individual contributor standpoint in terms of we don't have direct reports responding here, but our general view on this is when you look at the aggregate data, our individual contributors score the most favorable in these categories or from these business leader or executive comparisons. Any thoughts on that? Why do we think those individual contributors are scoring more favorably?
Couple thoughts, Christian. If these are less tenured individuals that are grading across the board, these individuals, this could be a first experience with a 360, not really sure what to expect, kind of testing the waters here, could trend to some higher scores. That could be a hypothesis. It could also be that there may be less on display, right? Sometimes it's harder and at a lower level to really know exactly, the quality of work that somebody else is doing if you're not seeing that all the time. Just a few initial thoughts that I had as far as that goes.
Right. Well, and I think kind of the inverse of Jefferson's point on the executive leaders, the expectations are a bit different at the front line as
Mhm.
well. And so the competencies in the assessment themselves are different, but also the expectations are, it's a different thing where we're not leading people. People aren't necessarily looking to us for this same contribution to the overall employee experience in general. Still, of course, all of us contribute to the employee experience at any level in the organization, but interesting. And again, these changes or these variations, are within a few decimal points here, but it is interesting to see that the trend is that group would score the most favorably.
And maybe, Christian, this is a good place to talk about the difference between a statistically significant difference and a practical or meaningful difference. Because I can see some of our audience saying, well, yeah, like statistically, there's probably no difference between these three groups and the scores that they get. And one of the things to really think about when you're looking at 360 assessments and ranges and scores and norms and values, let's set aside the statistic significance and let's take a look at the meaningful difference. Is there a meaningful difference, meaning someone who's rated at a 5 on a competency as opposed to a 6? I mean, that's going to impact, for example, if someone's rated, a 5 on a change management competency, as opposed to a leader who's a 6 or 6.5. I mean, if your organization's in the middle of a large change process, then that leader who has a 6.5, while that's not statistically different from a 5.5 or 5.75, that additional street cred, we could say, could go have a large impact on just the success of that change management. So sometimes when people take a look at 360 scores, they're like, yeah, but statistically, I'm the exact same as someone else, or I'm way better than the X, Y, and Z. And while that's a good conversation for academics to have, when we're taking a look at it for coaching purposes, let's just look at what's a meaningful difference or a meaningful score.
Right. No, I think that's a really good call out, where a little bit can go a long way into terms of what we actually see and experience from those around us. And so I'm glad you point out those differences. And also, and Kenna, you can speak to this too, in the coaching conversations, people can get very hung up on, this is a 5.3 and not, why isn't it a 5.5? And, it's a different kind of measure when we're working with this. These are employee perceptions. It's not the exact same thing as some of the operational metrics where we can get very precise with this thing. It's human perceptions captured a moment in time, but the differences can be very meaningful. Any improvement in any of these categories as we go further in this conversation are things that those around us can see and feel and appreciate.
Yep, absolutely.
So let's keep moving. There's a number of slides we want to talk about and just kind of set the stage for going deeper into this or another level of detail into our 360 assessment. So Jefferson, that last slide called out really those overall scores for those three different assessment levels within an organization. We want to look at those same levels, but we want to go into the next level of detail, which would be the competencies. So our assessments, those 360 survey or assessments that we send out, are comprised of different leadership competency areas. And as we mentioned, we use different competencies at those different levels in the organization. But a competency is a combination of knowledge, skills, attitudes, or other characteristics needed for effective job performance. Now, the items that we're using, just because we've got the most aggregate data for, are our standard assessments. But a lot of our organizations we work with will partner with us to create custom leadership models or leadership assessments using a competency model. We have a library of leadership competencies. This list does not include all 80 if you're counting them. This is just a subset of some of our competencies that we've just put on here to kind of paint the picture. But we love to tailor an assessment with the competencies aligned to your organizational needs, aligned to your strategy, to your values, those types of things. And that's really, if you've listened to our other webinars, one of the ways you can take 360s to the next level is to dial in the assessment to the actual needs or identity of the organization. What behaviors are we expecting in our leaders specifically here, and using competencies to get to that point. As I mentioned, we'll be using our standard assessments comprised of a number of wonderful competencies from our libraries to kind of guide our conversation. But on this next slide, to shape our conversation, let's focus only on those executive leaders. Those are the top of the organizations that have completed our 360 assessments in recent years. and we're looking at where they scored the most favorably. What's the competency or the category that scored the most favorably, and where did we see them score the lowest on average in our aggregate database? So Jefferson, walk us through, what do we see for our high scoring executives here?
For our executives, high scoring is around business strategy. Do our executives, do they know our industry? Do they know our position in the market? Do they know what our pathway is for success? And can they communicate that strategy to the organization? Now, the lowest happens to be around change management, right? Which includes, not only leading that change, but creating a coalition or an environment where others feel like they can join that change. And almost, I think of change management as change over the entire organization. And the other lowest scoring competencies for executive leaders, I think, is closely tied to it. It's developing others, which really is just change management on a micro level or on a personal one-by-one level. And the difference between these, you're looking at, the lowest scoring ones are around a 5 and the highest scoring competencies around a 6. So once again, a whole point difference. And maybe we can talk to you and Kenna. You guys have lots of consulting experience around these.
Yeah, very interesting. So I guess my question for Kenna, you and I have both done a lot of coaching with leaders at different levels. Looking at our executives, any surprises here? Or these the things you'd expect to be at the high scoring or in the low scoring when we look at this aggregate data?
Yeah, I wasn't too surprised at either of these, Christian. I would hope that would be the case for the highest scoring competency, that business strategy would be up there, right? And so that's right in line with what I see and would also hope for. As far as the lowest scoring competencies, not super surprised at the change management. A lot of that usually falls on executive leaders and executive management. And so that's too surprising. I see that come up in coaching conversations a lot about wanting to focus on change management as part of an action plan and kind of goal setting. As far as developing others, sometimes I think that executive management can be just maybe a bit more far removed from the growth conversations happening, or that we would hope happen at the lower levels. And I think some of that could account for that as well.
No, I think great insights. And also this tracks with my experience completely in terms of what we expect. And the interesting thing about that is, I'm with you. It's nice to see the validation that we hope executives have a strong sense of that business strategy. If these are the folks responsible for shaping and protecting and executing at the top of the organization this business strategy, we want them to have that strong skill area. But it also highlights, it kind of sets the stage for when there's outliers. So when I'm coaching an executive and they're not strong in business strategy, I know that is out of the norm. And so that kind of paints a picture of, well, we're seeing something that is below what's expected at your level, or what we expect to see or need to see at that level. And so understanding the highs and lows kind of helps for the coaching and interpreting results there. To the lowest score, developing others, I agree completely. In fact, we'll see that as a theme at all levels of leadership, this idea of development. I think as we move up in an organization, the number of competing priorities increases, and development, unfortunately, often gets deprioritized. Even that where at different points in our career, maybe that was a passion area for us, something we were really great at. As we move up, we are unable to prioritize, it seems like, and we see that pretty frequently. The question came in, do you all have recommendations on how to identify the critical differences versus the less important ones? And I would maybe even add to that, before I throw that to the group completely, is, critical differences for the individual, thinking about the report, and also maybe at the aggregate, if we see some of the themes if you collected this for, let's say, 30 of your leaders and are seeing some of these differences, when is that important? Kenna, I don't know if, in your experience, when you're coaching someone, how do you identify where there's a critical difference?
Absolutely. Well, I think as a whole at DecisionWise, we have kind of our scale key from our 7-point scale. We have identified kind of where base level competency is. And for us, that would be at a 4. So we hope all competencies are at that level, right? But then as far as critical differences, I walk leaders every day in each coaching session through what is significant here and what is less significant, right? And so in our behavioral section with competencies, gaps of 2.0 and greater are pretty significant. And we want to focus on those gaps. Lower gaps, maybe a little bit less so. And in the derailer section, it's a different number, right? And so we absolutely do have ways to identify that, kind of our base level competency, as well as which gaps to pay attention to, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. It's a great question and a great response. So a lot of times it's what does the leader want to accomplish, or what do we know that an organizational goal is? One difference, for example, often we might say innovation and creativity. In one role, a low score there might be a critical need. In another role, let's say I'm a leader of finance and accounting, creativity and innovation might not be the most important thing. And so there is the contextual aspect of this that we have to look at the data through. As we look at an organizational data, then, depending on group size and how scientific we want to be, there's still that contextual piece around what are we trying to accomplish as an organization? How does this competency align to our strategy? Is it mission critical? And then if we want to go even more scientific, we can do some of the great work that Jefferson does, where we go in and actually look at aggregate data and run more of take a statistical lens over it and actually try to understand where do we have differences that are more meaningful than others, especially if we're using this data to inform, an L&D program or succession work, some of those types of things we might want to put more of a fine point on some of those scores.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And Christian, if I wanted to assess my overall health, I can easily go and weigh myself on a scale. I can find out my blood pressure. I can find out my body fat percentage, take my temperature. But really, the best advice and help I'm going to get is to go to someone who is trained on how to look at across all of these different metrics and to identify where the most pressing need or concern is. So even though, my weight might not be where I want it to be, my doctor might recommend, hey, you really should focus on your blood pressure instead. And so one of the things I think to identify those critical areas is to work with someone who sees this type of data day in and day out, and who has that trained eye on how to point out those gaps that Kenna was talking about.
Yeah. Well, I think it's part of why this is a pretty timely conversation, because we're seeing more of a trend of, we're obviously looking at a very large database that we've been capturing and building and refining for years, but our clients can build their own database just with the platform that we've been very proud of and have been rolling out, in terms of it does a lot more for group analytics. And so this can be done at a micro scale, and also you can bring in some, we're happy to be that external lens and eye to take a view of kind of where those mission critical differences are as well. Great question. And please keep those questions coming. Maybe I'll keep us moving through some of these a little bit quicker, but business leader, that next level, again, this is probably the most widely distributed of our three focus assessments today. The business leaders used across all managers and a lot of directors as well. Highest scoring competency here is professional expertise. Lowest is developing others. Dun, 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 dun. Similar to what we saw with executives, this development thing, again, is something that leaders struggle with. Leaders at all levels, in my experience, is just a continuous area of improvement. Any thoughts on this for kind of this next level of leader, these two competency areas?
Yeah, not too different from my previous thoughts, and I'll go quick on this one, but not super surprised on either of these. This is one that I am excited to hope and see trend upwards soon. I would hope to see developing others score higher, especially since this is often direct managers with their direct reports, right? But this is right in line with what I see come up all day long, every day. When we start talking about action planning with these business leaders, and really turning this feedback into results, this is already part of their goals, their focuses. Usually when we start off the coaching sessions, we talk about goals and focuses before even diving into the data. And this is something on business leaders' minds right now, and right in line with what I see every day as a trend. So yeah, not surprised.
Yeah. I'll add another thought here. If we think of who this audience is, again, this could be first-time managers, it could be very seasoned managers and directors, but a lot of times what we see is people that have built up a real expertise, a proficiency, and so they're promoted. And so, it's wonderful to see that professional expertise that showing up as a high scoring area. If we were to expand that lowest scoring competency list, I would wager we'd see delegation rear its head pretty quickly, because a lot of times we're promoted because we're super doers. we're not promoted because we have all of management figured out. And so a lot of times, especially with newer managers, we'd see that professional expertise evidence, but with being able to manage their time effectively or delegate to other individuals. And so a really interesting thing to see here, and also developing others is often a new skill for them too, where if we're looking at those frontline managers specifically, but very, very interesting. Let's jump to our last of the three here, and then we'll go another level deeper on our insights here. But individual contributor, Jefferson, what do you see here?
I mean, we're seeing that our individual contributors, they're highly engaged in their work, right? Once again, they could be new to the organization or to the workforce in general, and they just bring this in excitement and enthusiasm. And also, individual contributor, I always remind myself, are those professional experts who just don't have anyone underneath them, who are really passionate and bring that passion to the work. And the lowest scoring competency, learning and development, I just think there's some blind spots, right? There's some blind spots that we don't see, or things that we're not even aware of as an individual contributor, or one might not be aware of as an individual contributor, that a process like 360 can really go and help you identify. I mean, I almost see this low scoring competency as the 360 helping to make it so that they understand what their strengths and opportunities for improvements are.
Yeah. Well, interesting. I love the personal engagement piece. So we're excited. We're bringing this energy, those individual contributors. That's where we're seeing that higher score in general, but also the consistent theme of the lowest score. So not only are we bad at developing others, maybe bad's the wrong word, but it's our lower scoring for those other levels of leader. But when we look at individual contributors, we're not super great at developing ourselves. And so there's this opportunity within every organization to understand, okay, what is growth? Who owns growth? What's my responsibility? And what are the resources available for me to grow myself, to expand and pursue what my own potential within this organization? What does growth mean to me? Does it mean promotion? Does it mean learning a new skill? So some interesting evidence that this conversation is important. And especially if we overlay the context of the Great Resignation and how firms are competing for talent. More and more we're going to see, and especially if we also throw in generational expectations of growth in the mix too, that this is increasingly important, that we're not only looking for the employee value proposition, but we're specifically looking at what's the organizational growth proposition for employees. How are you going to grow me in addition to compensate and, reward me that way? So, the results are pretty consistent that in the lowest scoring areas, that's this development theme is common across all levels. Let's go an extra level deeper here. Just some of the mechanics of how these assessments are built. I mentioned they're comprised of different competency areas, and each competency has behavioral statements. So these are specific, measurable, observable actions. So if we think through those development competencies, there's going to be specific statements aligned with those development competencies or any of those competencies that are actually the items that people are responding to in the assessment. So let's go that level deeper and see what we can see with each of these assessments. So executive leader first, again, we're going one level more specific. So the actual statements that scored the highest and the lowest for our executive leaders. So makes effective staffing decisions on key positions is our highest scoring item for executive leaders. The lowest scoring item for executive leaders are empowers others with resources and authority they need to succeed. Kenna, any thoughts on what you're seeing with this executive leader high and low statements?
Yeah, I'm happy to see the staffing decisions come up as the highest statement. I mean, I think that's huge. Without the right people in the right key positions, it's hard to have success, right? And so that makes me happy that overall that's happening in across industries here. The lowest scoring behavior, I will admit, I was a little bit surprised to see this one as the lowest one, though it does come up. Empowerment does come up in coaching conversations every day. I would have just a lot more follow follow-up questions, I think, dependent on the role, the industry, the company, what resources and authority people are seeking. But I think, I mean, you talked to delegation earlier. I think it's very related, even though this is under our competency of empowerment, if I'm remembering correctly. I think empowerment and delegation are pretty related here as far as people needing to feel that and maybe us needing to improve in that area as leaders. And so, a little bit surprised, but then again, when I think about it, makes sense. Would love to know your insights as well.
I'm right there with you. These aren't two that I would have guessed, actually.
Right. Yeah.
The others resonate just based on, hundreds of debriefs and coaching experiences. These are a bit of a surprise when we pull this level of specificity. I as we talk it through, I think we can make some sense around it. And item around the highest scoring, what I take away from that is that's actually a nice aspirational statement for the leaders the next level down. So if we're coaching business leaders, a key differentiator as we move up in the organization appears to be making those staffing decisions on key positions. That's something that leaders at the top of the organization are really great at. They know they've got to get these key positions filled, or else they're going to get pulled into the weeds. They're going to get pulled into, conflict and things. So getting the right people in the right positions, they understand as mission critical. And so, that's one takeaway or thing I'm seeing here. And then with the other piece, I made the jump to delegation as well, but you're right. This sits very firmly in our empowerment competency. So very interesting to see that's something at that top of the organization that we're still bumping into. Let's jump to that next level, the business leader. Highest scoring behavioral statement demonstrates a clear understanding of the factors that impact our success as a business, and then takes timely corrective action for poor performance. So I'm pleased to see that the understanding of the factors related to the business and that those around them, those responding to this 360 assessment, are related to you kind of understanding this concept of execution. If our business leaders are very much in the role of executing the strategy. And so it's good to see that this competency is trending the high, and also helps, again, sets the stage. If you see managers scoring low on this item, kind of that they're underperforming what we'd expect of their peers in that area. And then lowest scoring behavior. This is not a surprise to me at all, Kenna. This is an old friend. Timely corrective action for poor performance. That was a tongue twister, but usually these aren't our favorite conversations to have. And certainly leaders often either are putting them off or are failing to recognize when they're needed. I don't know, any thoughts, context on these items from either of you?
Yeah, I'll just say quickly that, again, not surprised. I see this come up every single day in my coaching conversation. So right in line with what I would expect here. Yeah.
We did have a comment from, I think, the last slide, and I'll just want to read it because I think it's a great point. The lowest scoring behavior for the executives is common in my experience with smaller, privately held organizations. And I think that's some really good context because I've seen that as well. For small, privately held, certainly founders often have a hard time letting go in some of these cases. And so I just wanted to go back and make sure we hit that comment. I think it was well said.
Yeah.
All right, let's jump into individual contributor. I'll keep us moving along here. Individual contributor, highest scoring behavior is honest, ethical, and trustworthy. And the lowest scoring uses his or her time effectively. Thoughts on these before I throw more of my meaning on there?
Jefferson, I'll let you jump in. I haven't heard your voice in a minute.
I'm just so glad that honest, ethicality, and trustworthiness is one of the highest scoring behaviors. I mean, I think that's something that anyone would really want at the beginning of their career, especially.
Yeah.
And that uses his or her time effectively. I mean, that could be part of just not knowing, what is the most effective way to use my time. Some of these individuals are just brand new into the field, and you sometimes have to go through the jungle to figure out what the best path is. And that takes time and effort, but it would be really great, going back to our behavior or our competencies, right? If managers and directors could develop and mentor these individual contributors so that they know, hey, here's the best way to use your time.
Right.
Yeah. And I love those points. I think I also was super happy to see that highest scoring behavior. That's what you would hope for, right? The lowest scoring behavior, and I'd be interested to dive deeper into the data. Jefferson, you could probably speak to that, at a different time. But I actually see this come up at all levels every day in my coaching conversations with business leaders and executive leaders. And so wondering if maybe this isn't such a problem just for individual contributors, but kind of across the board here is that at every level, there's some balancing acts that happen. There's some taking on too much or switching focus and things from task to task that I see at least come up every day.
I think, Kenna, you I'm sure share my experience when honest and ethical and trustworthy often is the most favorable competency in for a lot of leaders at every level and individual contributors certainly shows here. But those conversations where there's a challenge with that, where the leader is not scoring well with that, it becomes a very different conversation because unlike some of the other competencies, this one really ties into the character of the individual or how their character is perceived by others. And so it can be a sensitive, emotional experience for someone if this is the first time they're realizing. And if it's an individual contributor, newer in their career, in most cases, this could be one of the first times they're hearing this news versus our executives have usually had some exposure to feedback throughout their career and are more familiar. And so good to see it's high, but when it is low for those individual contributors, often it requires some effective coaching. And then that time effectively, we have an associated derailer statement around that too. And so an important point of realization, especially early in our career, that this is something that's impacting my effectiveness. Other people are experiencing it. Time management this can lead to a really productive conversation around dialing in some of their approach around that. So let's jump into industry trends. So leaving a bit of the focus on our individual assessment, let's talk about what we're seeing across different industries. Jefferson, do you want to talk a bit about, kind of how we organize our data and how we're breaking into these different industries?
Yeah, so our industries or all of our data, we classify it according to the North American Industry Classification System or their NAICS code. And this is a standardized system that many organizations use. And there are like 15 or 17 major industries that we look at. We just have a short example list or sample of what we use here. But each of the organizations are classified according to their NAICS code. And it helps us so that we don't have a bias in where an organization is placed, because sometimes organizations can easily fit into one of two or three major industries. But the interesting thing for us, going here on out, we're going to be looking at our business leader 360 assessment, because that's the assessment where we have a larger population behind.
Yeah, and just kind of taking it to the next level. So just focusing on the business leader where we've got the most data and looking at our industry options, what are we seeing?
So highest healthcare and social assistants, their average score is 5.9 with the range from 5.2 to 6.1. And manufacturing, which was not surprising to me based off the research I've done with employee engagement, tends to be the lowest with an average score of 5.5. And just to point out, once again, the ranges here are relatively similar, right? Almost the exact same. We're looking at about 5.1 to 6.1. But the differences in their average score, that can come from a lot of different reasons and perspectives.
Yeah, so it is interesting. And so if I'm inferring, and again, this is just me kind of speculating based on experience working with these different industries and things. So a couple things. Often we have a more educated workforce, which usually implies a little older employee further in their career within healthcare than we would assume in at least entry level within manufacturing, as well as we see a different connection to meaning and purpose. And again, we're generalizing. Some manufacturing environments have done a wonderful job cultivating a sense of meaning and purpose. But if we're looking at the aggregate, we see that higher in healthcare and social assistance. And so a different draw there for talent and management skills. So a little bit of an older employee sometimes brings in some life experience that helps in our management. When we look at manufacturing, entry-level employees, more of them may come in from directly from high school and move into a management role, fairly quickly as a shift lead or something like that. And so sometimes that impacts we have less life experience that's going to impact how we're leading others. Often we see a more robust L&D investment within healthcare than we do in a manufacturing environment. And so, those are just some of the factors. What's interesting here, I think, is the research opportunity we have ahead of us. For our team, we've got some wonderful things to dig in deeper and try to explore further. But those are some of my, just kind of free-flowing thoughts as to why we're seeing different scores based on these two industries. But interesting to see such a different management experience between these two. So let's talk about repeat 360s. So the idea here is a follow-up 360, correct, Jefferson? The same person taking an assessment at a later date.
Correct.
Okay. And I'm just going to read our stats here and then we can discuss a bit. Of those who participate in 2 360 assessments, 7 out of 10 increase one of their behavior scores by at least 10%. 3 of the 10 increase their behavior score by at least 20%. So that's telling us that when we measure follow-up, especially when those individuals have had some form of formal coaching associated with the 360 versus just having a 360 delivered to their email or dropped on their desk, and when they actually had a facilitated conversation, it becomes even more likely to see the increases, I think. But when we see the 360, this is some wonderful evidence that behaviors are improving.
When we take a look at negative behaviors, I should have added that word negative on the slide there. That 9 out of 10 repeat 360 participants decrease in negative behavior by 10%. 2 out of 10 decrease in negative behavior by at least 30%.
So that's referring more to our derailer section, those sections that we want those lower scores on. And
correct.
Okay. Well, sorry. That makes more sense. And I should have caught that as I reviewed these ahead of time, but that's a great point. So the main point is when we measure follow-up surveys with the same individual, and we don't have the luxury of that every time. Sometimes an organization runs a 360, once for an employee and never again. But we love it when we have repeat follow-up because it one, builds some accountability for the individual, and 2, it shows progress or builds urgency if they haven't done anything, if the problems persist. But what we're pleased to see in this data is that things got better, competencies improved, and those derailers, those things that can distract from our success or take away from the good things we're doing, were minimized when we saw the 360. And so some nice evidence that the 360 assessment is doing what it's designed to do, especially when it's accompanied by a coaching session.
Yeah. Christian, just to add to that, I loved these stats because it just spoke to my passion for what I do all day long, is just coaching, and the importance of, at the end of every session, we talk in depth about action planning and the fact that a lot of times individuals receive the 360 report and think, woohoo, the process is over, I'm done. And in reality, we kind of believe that's just the beginning of the process, right? The real goal is to turn the feedback into results. And that's going to come from, action planning and really taking the time to implement the things that we've talked about in a coaching session. And so I think as participants, take the time to go through coaching sessions, go through action planning, and then are able to have a follow-up, it just speaks to the importance of action planning and the power that comes from turning feedback into results as you do so.
I love that. And, if I go back into the kind of the coaching piece, for me, it's very fun to geek out over the numbers, and I could go into analytics and all day long. But this slide, I think, brings home the fact that each one of these assessments is associated with an individual and other people that provided feedback to that individual. And it's a very real and meaningful experience when it's done right, when a person receives that coaching conversation. We call it a purposeful disruptive experience, where we're disrupting the daily flow with some feedback so this person can take a moment to reflect, understand the experience they're creating for others, and make some adjustments. And the evidence here is that those adjustments are working, and that the assessment is creating that experience for others. So I hustled through some slides. As I mentioned, we could have talked about this and much, much more all day long. If we opened up the R console and watched Jefferson do his statistical wizardry, we would all be in awe, but we have some time limits. I saw another item come in for a question. how many action items do you typically recommend when doing the action planning? Great question. Kenna, what do you typically recommend?
Yeah, I've kind of condensed mine into a 5-step process that I recommend, starting from, sending a thank you email to raters, ending with selecting an accountability partner. And I go through kind of each of the action steps as I recommend conducting follow-up conversations. And we practice in our coaching session how to conduct those and in what ways the most productive. We talk about diving deeper into the report and activities I recommend with that. We talk about creating specific action plans and how to make them specific and effective. And so those are just examples of some of the steps, but I don't recommend too many. We want to make it bite-sized enough to have them be successful. Yeah. And then as far as specific action plans, we don't really recommend selecting more than 2 to 3 main items to focus your action plan on so that you can be successful and see that improvement. But that's just a little general overview of my action planning conversations.
Right. I think it's beautifully said. There's kind of this process, this tactical process that we found to be very effective. I think you've zeroed in on that very well. And also in terms of prioritizing, an assessment might have, somewhere between 10 and 20 different competencies in it. And sometimes the coachee or the participant may want to select 10 things to work on. And so I think, to your point, I'm in the same boat. I'm usually down 1 to 3 areas coming out of this, and then going through some of those 5 action steps you talked about very well. If you try to do 5 things, you'll fail. You won't do anything. And so focusing in on what matters most. Great question. These are fun conversations for us, particularly where we're able to take a moment out of our coaching and running these programs and working with individuals and groups to look at the aggregate data and to explore the themes and to kind of understand some of the other macro trends that we're seeing in the numbers. And we're going to continue doing these sessions as well as exploring what's possible within a single organization for group analytics and understanding. As I mentioned, it's a great way to inform succession planning as well as L&D efforts and a number of other areas, in addition to aligning a competency model to an organizational strategy and all sorts of wonderful work that can be done through multi-rater feedback. Kenna, Jefferson, anything to add or that we missed in our conversation today?
I think you nailed it on the head, Christian. I love talking about these things. I could talk all day about coaching and the importance of turning feedback into results and 360s. So it was fun to dive in a little deeper. I feel like we barely scratched the surface, but very fun to dive in.
I know. I feel like we should have added to our title the slide light at the end, because there's 360 feedback, insights, and analytics light, because we're not able to go very deep. But appreciate everyone's questions and comments, and I hope this was of value to the larger group. We certainly enjoyed ourselves. And again, if you have any questions for us, please feel free to reach out through our website or info@DecisionWise.com. We'll go ahead and wrap this up, and hopefully look to see you all again soon on a future webinar.